No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 14. The dynamic duo of Mings and Morgan. To the indigenous Arawak Indians, the place was known as Hemaka Island, Island of Fountains, for the thermal springs that sprouted from the limestone honeycombs of its interior plateau. To the Spaniards, under whose flag Columbus had claimed it, the island was at first Santiago, and then Jamaica, in an approximate Spanish spelling of the Indian name. By any appellation, it was a land largely avoided by Spanish colonists, who favored the richer mineral deposits and civilized cities of Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and the mainland of Central and South America. Scorpions skulked in the dark Jamaican corners. Multitudes of land crabs made strange nighttime sounds as they scuttled from the forests to feed on the beaches. Sandflies left bleeding welts, and clouds of malarial mosquitoes required that greenwood fires be built windward at night. All these creatures occurred on the other large islands as well, but somehow on Jamaica they seemed larger, more numerous, and more vicious. In 1534, the Spanish built a dreary little capital, St. Iago de la Vega, on an alluvial plain 13 miles inland from the south coast. The nearby land was divided into plantations, and sugar cane was introduced. But the attempt at colonization was half-hearted at best, and by the middle of the 17th century the Spanish crown had all but abandoned the island, leaving only about 1,500 settlers, 3,000 black slaves, and a garrison numbering no more than 200 soldiers. On May 10, 1655, a British fleet dropped anchor in what later became Kingston Harbor, and sent ashore troops who within 24 hours put to rout what Spanish defenders they could find. Yet for the attackers, Jamaica was at best a sorry consolation prize. The British force had sailed from Barbados with the bold intention of seizing Santo Domingo, the capital of Spanish Hispaniola. But the aggressors had badly botched the job and, after being easily repulsed, decided to swoop down upon helpless Jamaica as a means of saving face. What neither the Spanish nor the British understood at the time, though both would know it soon enough, was that Jamaica was a key to the control of the Caribbean. More than 140 miles long from east to west and 50 miles across at its broadest point, Jamaica blocked the southern sea approaches to the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola. It would serve Britain as a wedge between two Spanish islands, holding a central strategic position almost equidistant from Cartagena, Panama, and the tips of the Yucatan Peninsula and Florida. Jamaica offered a splendid base as well for raids against both the mainland cities and the treasure galleons making their way to rendezvous at Havana. The island possessed one of the world's greatest natural harbors, which the British would shortly render all but impregnable by heavily fortifying the reef that nearly enclosed the entryway. That spit of land had been named Caguaya by the Spanish. The British at first called it Caguay, and a town by that name sprang up at the harbor's entrance. Later, as Port Royal, it would become the greatest buccaneering stronghold in the Caribbean, far outstripping Hispaniola's Tortuga, and causing such grief to the Spanish crown that nightly prayers were said in Seville, calling on God's wrath for its destruction. The fleet that captured Jamaica for Britain tarried no longer than absolutely necessary, and made sail for home after scarcely a month. To secure this new challenge to the Spanish Empire, the British left behind 12 small warships and a garrison of about 6,000 men. These were the dregs of the British Isles and Barbados, described by their erstwhile commander, Sir Robert Venables, as the most profane, debauched persons that we ever saw, and described by one of their own number as Hectors and Knights of the Blade, with common cheats, thieves, cutpurses, and such like lewd persons about their group. But among these caitiffs and cullions was a young Welshman, still short of his 21st birthday, of obscure origin, whose name would ring as with the clash of steel against steel throughout the Spanish Main for the better part of 3 decades. His name was Henry Morgan. Harry to his friends, the very devil to the Spanish. and from Jamaica he would bring the age of the buccaneers to blood-red flower. Not much is known about the early life of Henry Morgan. The only recorded statement from him about his youth is, "I left school too young and have been more used to the pike than the book." He was certainly born in Wales, but the exact date is not known. The approximate year of his birth is only known because of a November 21st, 1671 deposition in which he said he was then 36 years old. The name, occupation, and social status of his father are unknown, but Henry was almost surely raised in a military atmosphere. Two of his uncles were prominent soldiers, and they would play important, although indirect roles in Henry Morgan's career. One of his uncles, Thomas Morgan, was something of an expert in the budding science of siege artillery. During England's Civil War, Thomas chose the parliamentary side, and as a major general became second in command to George Monk, who had been appointed by Oliver Cromwell to subjugate Scotland. Years later, when General Monk turned his coat, overthrew the parliamentary regime, and placed Charles II on the throne, he was, as Duke of Albemarle, in a position to perform favors for Thomas Morgan, and Morgan's kinsmen, including young Henry. The other uncle, Edward Morgan, was a mercenary officer in the unceasing conflicts then besetting Europe. While in Germany, during the 30 Years' War, he wooed and married the daughter of the Baron of Pölnitz, governor of the city of Littstadt. Unlike his brother, Edward cast his lot with the Royalists in England's struggle, and when his cause was lost, he went into exile with his in-laws in Germany. Finally redeemed by Thomas Morgan's influence with Albemarle, Edward would help to bring Henry Morgan to the favorable attention of Jamaica's authorities. As murky as Henry Morgan's boyhood in Wales was the manner by which he came to the Caribbean. The buccaneer chronicler John Esquemeling said that the young Morgan had been snatched out of a waterfront place of entertainment and taken as an indentured servant to Barbados, where he won his freedom by volunteering to join the expedition to Hispaniola and Jamaica. Other versions of this story, equally likely, are that Morgan signed with the expedition either in England or Barbados to escape imprisonment for brawling, or because he had been found out as a malignant, as the Puritans called Royalist sympathizers, or because he wished to escape an outraged father whose daughter Morgan had sullied. In any case, the important points are that Henry Morgan almost surely accompanied the force that captured Jamaica, that he was hardy enough to survive the pestilence that mowed down many others, and that he found the place congenial to a man given to such violent action. He was not a large man, but he was lean and strong, with a Welshman's swarthy complexion, a prominent nose, and dark, arrogant eyes. In personality he was difficult to judge. His tongue carried both a lilt and a lash, and he always communicated with vigor with his words, wrote Esquemeling, and infused such spirits into his men as were able to put every one of them instantly upon new designs. There seems little doubt that he was driven by loyalty and love for England, yet he consistently turned his patriotism to his personal profit. Though lawless, he was evidently something of a sea lawyer, and he rarely sailed forth on his maraudings without an authorizing document, even if of dubious pedigree. Renowned for the wolfish ferocity of his assaults, he also possessed a fox-like cunning, and some of his greatest triumphs resulted as much from guile as from the open test of arms. Finally, and perhaps most important, although he apparently took a perverse pride in his lack of formal schooling, Henry Morgan had an immense capacity for learning through bloody experience. Though the Spaniards had little use for Jamaica, they could not abide an English bastion virtually at the heart of their empire, so they maintained a number of guerrilla bands along the island's north coast. There were perhaps 500 men in all, reinforced and supplied from Cuba under Don Cristobal Arnaldo Isasi, son of a former governor of Jamaica and brother to the Spanish lieutenant general in Cuba. Suppressing these Spaniards was a job at times for just about every able-bodied man in the English settlement, and Morgan was most certainly among the forces that went against Isasi. The tactics that were employed in this deadly little war contained elements that Morgan later perfected. Swift approaches by sea to the general area occupied by the enemy, undetected landings in some hidden harbor, stealthy overland marches to a Spanish encampment, and savage surprise attacks with no quarter given or asked. The guerrilla actions continued for 3 years, until in the spring of 1658, the British spotted 3 Spanish vessels unloading cannon on the north coast. Some 600 hastily assembled Britons descended on the guerrillas, who had foolishly concentrated their forces. Though Isasi himself escaped, the Spanish were virtually wiped out. The commander of this expedition was a little pepperpot from whom Henry Morgan would learn much. He was Commodore Sir Christopher Mings, who had captained a frigate in the invasion fleet and had decided to make his fortune in Jamaica. Mings was a fine sailor with a keen appetite for Spanish treasure and a flawless instinct for finding it. In 1659, he decided to attempt the most difficult and unexpected voyage in the West Indies, beating southeast into the prevailing trade winds to strike at the Spanish Main near its easternmost Venezuelan extremity. The South American coast was only 600 miles distant on a direct line, but by the time Mings, in the Marston Moor, accompanied by 2 other ships, had finished tacking across the Caribbean, he had traveled more than 1,000 miles. For his first target, Mings chose Cumana, the center for Spanish pearl fisheries along the Venezuelan coast. Sweeping in without warning, the British raiders routed the astonished settlers and sacked the city, reaping rich rewards. Mings next sailed west for 250 more miles, to fall upon the silver depot of Puerto Cabello, where the yield was somewhat disappointing. But then, 125 miles farther west at Coro, a small and supposedly insignificant town, Mings had a marvelous stroke of luck. At the approach of the British, Coro's inhabitants fled to the woods and led Mings straight to a cache of silver. There were 22 chests in all, each weighing over 400 pounds and marked for the King of Spain. All told, they contained about 1.5 million pieces of 8, then worth about 375,000 British pounds. It was a haul of monumental proportions, more than had been taken on any single raid since Francis Drake had seized the treasure ship Cacafuego nearly a century before. Even when shared with his company, the loot was enough to make Mings rich for life. There is no direct proof that Henry Morgan accompanied Mings on this lucrative excursion, but his presence seems entirely likely, in view of the fact that shortly thereafter, Henry Morgan, without other known means, had enough capital to purchase his own small ship, the first documented record relating to Morgan, a commission as a privateer signed by Jamaica's Governor Thomas Windsor, shows that Captain Henry Morgan was the owner of one of the 10 ships sailing with Commodore Mings on September 21, 1661, against a major Spanish bastion, Santiago, Cuba's second-largest port, near the eastern tip of the island. The operation turned into a classic piece of improvisation. The little fleet set sail from Port Royal under cloudy skies with a light easterly wind, rounded Negril Point at Jamaica's western end, and slowly clawed towards Santiago, 150 miles northeast. But the wind soon died, and the ships struggled along, rarely making more than 3 knots. An unexpected southwest current of up to 2.5 knots cut their actual speed to a knot or less, sometimes taking them backwards towards Jamaica when the wind failed entirely. Finally, after 15 frustrating days, the fleet neared its destination, and Mings called his captains to a council of war. It was decided to sail audaciously straight into Santiago harbor and grab the Spaniards directly by their beards. On October 5th, Mings at last sighted the massive fortifications of the Castillo de Moro, high on a cliff guarding the entrance to the harbor. The passage itself was no more than a long, narrow slot, in places only 60 yards wide between the Sierra Maestra walls, which fell sheer into the sea. It would be suicide to try an assault through this deadly corridor. With remarkable facility, Mings quickly switched plans. Turning his fleet west, he sailed 2 miles along the coast, as far as the mouth of the San Juan River. There, out of sight of the Spaniards, he put his 1,300 men ashore. That night, Mings and his men forced their way through the forest on a very treacherous path to attack Santiago from the rear at dawn's first light. At daybreak, Mings and his men charged into the town. The surprised Spaniards were routed, including Don Cristobal Arnaldo Isasi, the same Isasi who had opposed the English on Jamaica. In addition to his many talents, Mings also knew how to loot. For 5 days his men toiled in what could only have been a labor of love, carrying chests of silver and barrels of sugar and wine to the English ships now anchored in the harbor. The guns of the Castillo de Moro were shoved off a precipice into the sea. From the great fort's magazines, Mings took 700 barrels of gunpowder. He distributed them at strategic intervals around the edifice and lighted fuses. Mings later wrote of the explosion that truly it was so demolished, the greater part lies level with the foundations. On October 22nd, drums rolled and guns boomed in salute as Christopher Mings came home past the Caguay with his fleet, his booty, and now his 6 Spanish ships captured at Santiago. For nearly 2 more years, Mings, and Henry Morgan with him, made the Spanish Main miserable for its owners. But in the summer of 1663, the feisty Commodore was recalled to England, where he stayed until he was killed in a battle against the Dutch 3 years later. Meanwhile, Morgan, having learned his lessons well from Mings, struck out on his own in an exploit that was to propel him to buccaneering eminence. The maturing of Henry Morgan began as a joint venture with 4 other captains, about whom little is known save for their surnames and nationalities, the Englishmen Morris, Freeman, and Jackman, and the single Dutchman Martin. But Morgan soon became their recognized leader. In 1663, the 5 sailed from Jamaica, carrying documents of highly dubious validity, privateers' commissions bearing the signature of Governor Windsor, who by now had been back in England for nearly 2 years. Just as Mings had done on his Cumana expedition, Morgan and his Confederates sought Spanish towns that had long gone unmolested, where garrisons had grown indolent, through inaction, and cannonballs had become so encrusted with rust that they could no longer be fired. The 5 ships, carrying perhaps 200 men, sailed northwest around the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, where they caught a strong current that helped carry them about 400 miles westward. Even while staying far enough off the coast to avoid being flung onto the shore by one of the vicious storms that frequently blew down from the north, Morgan's men kept a sharp eye for the muddy waters that signified the mouth of the Grijalva River. Their destination was Villahermosa, capital of the province of Tabasco, some 50 miles up the river. The buccaneers finally found the Grijalva, but in short time they discovered that their problems were only just beginning. Though the river was navigable, by sailing up it to Villahermosa, Morgan would have had to sacrifice the surprise fundamental of his tactics. Instead, he stopped at an Indian village about 3 miles upstream, hid his ships, and enlisted some Spanish-hating guides to lead him around the swamp that stretched for 20 miles on both sides of the river. With the help of the locals, Morgan and his men finally reached Villahermosa and sacked the town, taking all the plunder they could carry away. But when they returned to the mouth of the Grijalva, having marched no fewer than 300 miles, they were faced with calamity. To his horror, Morgan discovered that his ships had been taken away by a powerful Spanish scouting party that had stumbled onto the hideaway and had overwhelmed the skeleton crews. Morgan and his crew were now stranded. But not for long. 2 Spanish barks, accompanied by 4 cargo canoes, seaworthy sailing craft in their own right of up to 40 feet in length, soon entered the Grijalva, blissfully unaware of the desperate buccaneers lurking nearby. As the barks and canoes passed close to shore, Morgan and his men burst from the bush, swarmed aboard, and seized the craft. Now Morgan again had transportation as well as his loot, and any reasonable man would have headed home as quickly as possible. But reason was never Morgan's way. Instead, sailing and paddling for all they were worth, the buccaneers labored eastward to the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, then took a southerly course across the Gulf of Honduras, and finally made anchorage at Monkey Point, on the eastern edge of what is now Nicaragua. Since leaving Jamaica, they had traveled more than 2,600 miles, and they were now only arriving on the threshold of their crowning achievement. Morgan meant to locate and capture the near-mythical city of Gran Granada, reputedly an original repository of Aztec treasure and now, under the Spaniards, a rich agricultural and silver mining center. The buccaneers knew only from legends that it lay somewhere far up a malignant jungle river, somewhere across cruel mountains, and somewhere on an enormous and bountiful lake. Morgan enlisted some Indian guides who said they could take him there, and he was determined to go. According to an official account by a new governor of Jamaica, to whom Morgan reported when he eventually returned home, the buccaneers loaded their captured canoes with provisions, and with their Indian guides worked their way up the North Fork of the San Juan River, traveling over 100 miles before they came to a fair lake of sweet water, full of excellent fish, with its banks full of brave pastures and savannas, covered with horses and cattle, where they had as good beef and mutton as any in England. This was Lake Nicaragua. Morgan's men, hiding by day under keys and islands, and rowing all night, by the advice of their Indian guides, landed near the city of Gran Granada. In Morgan's report, he mentioned that this town is bigger than Portsmouth, with 7 churches and a very fair cathedral, besides diverse colleges and monasteries, all built of free stone, as also most of their houses. The buccaneers swooped upon Gran Granada, the modern city of Granada in southwest Nicaragua, not in the gloaming hours, but while the sun was shining down on the complacent city. Morgan and his men fired a volley, overturned 18 great guns in the Parada place, took the sergeant major's house, wherein were all the arms and ammunitions, secured inside the great church 300 prisoners, plundered for 16 hours, then discharged the prisoners, sunk all the boats that could follow them, and left with their loot. How much the loot amounted to is not known, but it was enough to return Morgan to Jamaica a hero and a wealthy man. Now, with this amazing campaign, further buoying the already rapidly building momentum of Morgan's reputation, he was poised to take his legendary buccaneering to the next level.